next, but first, some news to share with you. As reported here last week, the Vatican has entered into a landmark deal with China, agreeing to cooperate with the communist atheist regime in the appointment of bishops. The Vatican announced the deal Saturday, saying the church there is now unified and that all bishops in China are in communion with Rome. On Tuesday, during his return flight from the Baltics, Pope Francis acknowledged the deal will cause suffering among the underground faithful who have resisted the government-run church for decades, and he takes full responsibility for their pain. More on this later with Robert Royal. And meanwhile, in Germany, the head of the German Bishops' Conference is apologizing on behalf of the church there after a devastating internal report on priestly abuse was leaked to the media. Der Spiegel recently reported that from 1946 to 2014, at least 1,670 clerics were accused of abuse of more than 3,000 alleged victims. 1 in 6 cases involved rape. The victims were predominantly male, nearly 1,000 of them altar boys. The magazine noted that in many cases, evidence was destroyed or manipulated. In a news conference on Tuesday, Cardinal Reinhard Marx said, "For too long in the church, we have looked away, denied, covered up, and didn't want to believe it to be true. For all the failure, pain, and suffering, I must apologize as the chairman of the Bishops' Conference as well as personally." And in the wake of the German abuse report, Der Spiegel is calling out the bishops and Pope Francis himself. In a cover story this week entitled, "Thou Shalt Not Lie," the weekly magazine opines that Francis, who started his pontificate with the promise of being a, quote, brilliant reformer, is on the verge of squandering his legacy, pointing to his silence on whether he knew about the abuse history and disgraced former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. It notes that Francis often speaks at inopportune moments, yet in important moments remains silent, and that he is dragging his feet instead of meeting the crisis head-on. Although the Vatican press office has gone out of its way to echo the recent support of Pope Francis coming from church hierarchy, Der Spiegel suggested that there is more resistance to the Francis pontificate within the Holy See than is commonly believed. The article quotes one cardinal under the condition of anonymity who said of the pontiff, quote, "He preaches mercy, but in reality he is an ice-cold, cunning Machiavellian. And what is worse, he lies," end quote. Here with analysis and a preview of the upcoming Youth Synod is the editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, one-third of the papal posse. Robert Royal returns to the program.
Great
Thank
to
you
be
for
with
being
you.
here. As always, I want to play a bit of video. This week, one of the major stories that got scant coverage elsewhere is the Vatican-Beijing Accord. This accord would grant the Chinese authorities a hand in choosing bishops. Cardinal Parolin, who is the Vatican Secretary of State, issued this message to explain the accord. Watch.
The signing of a provisional agreement between the Holy See and the People's Republic of China concerning the appointment of bishop is of a great importance, especially for the life of the Church in China, for the dialogue between the Holy See and the authorities of that country, and also for the promotion of an horizon of peace in these present times in which we experience so many tensions at the international level. The Holy See intends just to create the condition, or to help to create the condition of a greater freedom, autonomy, and organization, in order that the Catholic Church can dedicate itself to the mission of announcing the gospel.
Will this help achieve greater freedom, autonomy, and the freedom to announce the gospel in China?
I'm very doubtful of that. All those words are very nice words, horizons of freedom,
Peace.
etc., space, and reducing tensions. But we're dealing basically with a communist regime here. And I wrote a book about the 20th century martyrs, and people used to criticize me because I had so many communist martyrs in the book. But it's simply the fact of the matter that communism tends to persecute religion, and it produces martyrs, it produces gulags, it produces laogaias. In the case of China, look, this is a country that we know persecutes churches, been pulling down churches, pulling crosses off churches. It has been promoting abortion, enforcing abortion on people. It represses human rights. It's a polluter. I mean, whatever the Vatican has said about the Chinese being sort of a model of Catholic social teaching. In fact, all these things contradict what we know about the statement that makes it look glowing like something good is going to happen. So I'm very skeptical about this, and we've got experience in the past. The Concordat that was signed with Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And you know, I looked at that very carefully when I did my book. Those people at the time said, well, there's no way to restrain Hitler. At least maybe we can get him to live up to some parts of this agreement. And that just failed miserably. Look, if you try to imagine concretely, you know, forget about the theory for a moment. Concretely, what advantage does the church get in these circumstances? This is a country, as we know, that persecutes religious people, that throws people into gulags, they call them laogai there, that forces abortions on people, that is a tremendous polluter, whatever some figures in the Vatican say about the Chinese being almost a model of Catholic social teaching is kind of crazy. So if you look very concretely at what advantage does accrues to the church by having this agreement with the Chinese, it's hard to, I can see what advantage the regime has, because now it has sort of unified control over the church to a certain degree, because there's going to be some resistance in the underground church. But what is the advantage for the church? There are some people who try to make this case that now there'll be a dialogue going on, but it's a dialogue with the devil.
No, I've heard that. It's the opening of a door. Some have criticized us for having Cardinal Zen on these airwaves, but you know, I've known Cardinal Zen now for almost 2 decades. I know a lot of people in China who have such respect for him. It's obvious the price he's paid for standing up. He was part of the Vatican Commission at one time, which they shut him out of as they fast-tracked this deal. They didn't want any native Chinese speakers being involved in the process because he understood the minds and the hearts of these Chinese dictators and how they see the church. I would, had I been the Pope, I would have put Zen as the lead negotiator. You may have not gotten very far, but you wouldn't end up where you are now. Now, some people say, indeed, the Vatican is trying to make the case that this is just a continuation, Robert Royal, of what John Paul II and Benedict intended. This is the fruition, the blossoming of that interaction. Do you agree with that?
Well, yeah, there was a process. There was a conversation going on, but it never fell over into what I think is people write me and say that this is the largest betrayal of authentic Catholics in the history of the church. I don't know if that's true or not, but at least a couple of people who I think are very well informed have said this sort of thing. You know, I wrote a book on the 20th century martyrs, and I got criticized in some quarters because there were so many communist martyrs in my book. But it's simply a fact that this murderous ideology, and let's not forget that however different China may be in certain respects, it still has that general profile. So you look at them and you have to expect that similar things that happen in other countries are going to happen in China. And if we look back, for example, at the Cold War, who are the figures that we really admire? Sheptynsky in Ukraine, Wyszynski in Poland, Mindszenty, Stepanak, all these resistors. And I think when we look back at this moment in history, I don't know, 50 or 100 years from now, we're going to say Zen was right, and the softer approach led to disaster.
I want to share this with you. During the Pope's press conference on his way back from Estonia on Tuesday, Pope Francis took responsibility for this controversial deal between the Vatican and China. He acknowledged that the deal over the nomination of bishops will cause suffering among the underground faithful. He said this, "You know that when you make a peace agreement or a negotiation, both sides lose something. This is the law, both sides. And you move ahead. I think of the resistance, the Catholics who have suffered. It is true they will suffer. Always in an agreement there is suffering. They have faith." Well, my Twitter followers exploded over this when they read that statement. I even had some Chinese respondents who were, you know, livid over this. Is this basically saying, you underground people who have been under house arrest, tortured, had families separated, been murdered, or had members of your family murdered, lump it. We're all one now. We have unity, and that seems to be the big goal here. We have unity. But people don't understand because they don't get this situation, and I guess we've been following it for so long. There's the Catholic Patriotic Association, which is essentially a government-run fake church with the exterior, but the government runs it. And then you have the authentic Catholics faithful to the Pope who've been living basically in persecution for all these years. The Pope is saying, we're bringing you all together now. You can come out of the shadows. Legitimate, what he said there?
Well, there's a little bit of fuzziness between the two of these, and it's a strange thing in China because that's the particular case on the ground, that there seems to be just a little bit of bleeding over from one thing to another. But I think it's unfortunate that the Holy Father put it that way, because if you say both sides lose something, I go back to this. I know what the Church lost. I think we're going to see more and more aggressive moves on the part of the Chinese regime to take control of the Church. That's clearly their aim. They've always proposed that, not only for the Catholics, but for Protestants and even on Christians. They don't like having independent sources of moral authority in communist
outside
regimes.
of China.
So we know what the Church is giving up. What is China giving up? I don't see this equivalent that both sides have given up something, and both sides are suffering. We know what our underground friends, who we trust and proclaim as heroes and sometimes martyrs, as you rightly say. We know what they're giving up. What are the Chinese giving up?
Well,
I can't see anything.
Megachurches are being destroyed. You've got a million Muslims in their own concentration camp. I mean, religious freedom is not a bright light in China. It's just not. And you say, what is the Church giving up? 7 bishops who were excommunicated, not appointed by Rome, are now granted full privileges and brought into the fold, while 2 legitimate suffering bishops, old elder bishops, so they be, of dioceses, are basically being asked by the Vatican, have been asked to move aside, so these illegitimate bishops, who yesterday were illegitimate, today are perfectly fine, to take their place. How is that fair, just, merciful to the people who've been suffering and bleeding for decades on the ground there? I don't see it.
I don't see it either. My friend George Weigel has said, I think quite cogently, that when communism falls in China, which it will, because communism...
Well, it always falls.
Communism contradicts human nature, and it will eventually fall. Could take a while. But as he's rightly said, I think, when that does happen, and people look to the churches now to provide sort of moral fiber to the ongoing future of the society, who are they going to look at? Are they going to look to the people who resisted, or are they going to go to look to the people who cooperated? So it's I think it's a high-risk move that the Vatican has made, and I hope I'm wrong about this, but I don't believe it's going to turn out well.
I want to move on. Pope Francis gave this anecdote when he was on that papal plane ride, and he referenced this agreement saying this: when there was a famous communique of an ex-apostolic nuncio, the bishops of the world wrote me saying clearly that they felt close, that they were praying for me. The Chinese faithful wrote, and the signature of this writ was from a bishop. Let's say it this way: of the traditional Catholic Church, from a bishop of the Patriotic Church, together and faithfully, both of them. For me, it was a sign from God. I want to move beyond the little anecdote about China and reference what he said early on, which was clearly indicating that the Vigano testimony, he talked about a famous communique from an ex-apostolic nuncio. Do you think that's still preying on the Pope's mind, even though he hasn't really addressed it much? He mentioned it there.
It is. We have seen through a number of the homilies that he's given at Masses before he went to the Baltic states that he's been talking about people who are accusers, and that the devil is an accuser. And I mean, it's just impossible to imagine that after charges like that, it's already been several weeks, but still after charges like that, any person would still be going through these charges and trying to figure out what's true and what's false and how to respond to it. So yeah, I think he's preoccupied with this. I think, again, unfortunately, he's gone on this road of saying that you are an accuser, like the devil is an accuser.
Right, he's been saying that in homilies.
That the devil is the one who accuses sinners rather than forgiving the way God does, and tries to create scandal and division.
Right.
However, we're dealing with many cases of sexual abuse and the cover-up of sexual abuse. And this means that who's the first accuser in these cases? It's the victim. We don't know about these things unless a victim comes forward and is willing to go on the record. So it's unfortunate that I think the Holy Father is mixing what is true at a very high theological level with a set of circumstances in which crimes have been committed and people have been sometimes unjustly accused, but usually unjustly ignored in these circumstances. And that cannot simply be wished away because accusation can sometimes be anti-Christian. We need accusations that actually bring forward the truth about the church so that the church can heal from this terrible situation in which we find ourselves.
He also made the comment again in the air that the Philadelphia report that had thousands of cases of abuse, Pennsylvania rather, that indicated that the church has addressed this crisis and it is working. Is the Pope, do you think there's a blind spot here when it comes to this issue of sexual abuse, ongoing sexual abuse, not only of minors, but of teens and adults in the seminary setting?
Yeah, look, if what he was saying, and he tends to speak in not the clearest language to begin with.
Yep.
So if what he was saying is that there was a large bump of cases, as we would agree, in the 70s and 80s, yes, it's true, and yes, it's true that some of the measures that our bishops and maybe other bishops' conferences have put in place have been effective in rooting out past perpetrators and in tracking down people immediately in the present moment. Now, that much is true. But to think that we are now beyond that, and of course the really hot button question at this point is, what about bishops? Bishops that covered up, and also bishops who were, like McCarrick, were themselves perpetrators not only of abuse, but of crimes against underage, usually boys.
Yep.
So that is the part of it that now the church needs to go on to that second phase. We can continue to refine.
Yeah, but the protocols against the violation of a minor, those have been established, and in the most part, the Pope is right. Those have worked. But now we have a different, this crisis has evolved into something else. The misuse of power, bishops misusing their authority to either protect or nurture rings of these predators and send them into the next generation while predation continues all along the line. Why is there an inability to address that? There was the Der Spiegel article this weekend, a 19-page expose. It called the Pope out. Tell us what it means that Der Spiegel, a very secular publication, is focusing on the issue this way. What does it tell us?
Well, Der Spiegel is I would say, sort of moderately liberal or liberal magazine, and kind of like Time magazine would be in the United States. It's clearly not pro-Catholic, it's not conservative, it's not traditional.
Right.
So for them, having seen these charges that have been made, they went to Argentina and looked into the then Cardinal Bergoglio's activities in Argentina, and they see scores of cases in which the Archdiocese of Buenos Aires either ignored people or at least
ignored victims who came forward.
Yes, ignored victims who came forward, and at least in one case seriously defended a priest who was clearly guilty. There went on for years and years, and eventually the secular authorities convicted him, and now he's in prison. He's still a priest, but he's in prison. The thing that's puzzling about this is that, as in Chile, we remember the case in Chile of Bishop Barros, who the Pope insisted on appointing over against the popular protests that were coming forward. He clearly was advised by one of the members of his C9, his sort of cabinet, and I think it's Cardinal Errázuriz. He was clearly advised that Barros was innocent. He was not innocent, because we came to learn, and then the Pope himself said, I was part of the problem, he apologized for it. The fact that Der Spiegel would go to Argentina and find that there are a number of abuse cases there that seem to be, I mean, we don't say that it was an out-and-out cover-up, but it's clear that a lot of cases weren't dealt with, that there was no responsiveness to the cries of these victims of priestly abuse. So I think that if there's a blind spot here, it may partly include that in the past, the Holy Father himself has not exactly known how to deal with these circumstances, or did not deal with them all that well when he was a bishop in Argentina.
Yeah, has a blind spot when it comes to them. For whatever reason, he sides with the priest over the accuser. And whereas that might be a nice thing on the surface, once you get to the details, like that Father Inzoli case in Italy, where the guy was removed from ministry, they bring him back. He's convicted on 12 counts by the Italian authorities. Then we push him out of the priesthood again. And the Pope did that on his own authority. Why? Why?
Well, look, we know from all of his papacy that he's a strong advocate of mercy. And so
Yes.
he sees somebody who's been accused. I mean, as he's said about there shouldn't be life sentences, there shouldn't be capital punishment. He sees someone who's accused of something, whether a priest or a secular figure, and he wants to kind of express mercy. But
where's the
look,
mercy for the victim?
Yes, the whole question is we need truth and we need a process that is actually going to hold people accountable and find out what happened and why it happened. Were there breakdowns in communication? Was there a breakdown in enforcement? All that, I think, is just somehow beyond him for a variety of reasons.
Jesus told the apostles, defend the flock, not defend the shepherds. So, but I got to get to this. In 3 months, it has been 3 months since Cardinal McCarrick resigned from his cardinal title. And not his priesthood, just that title he rescinded, or he gave it up. The Vigano testimony came a few weeks after that. The bishops went to Rome, the United States bishops, begging for an inquiry backed by the Vatican with canonical penalties and canonical eyes to investigate what happened and how he progressed up the ladder of the hierarchy, even with full knowledge of his crimes. They were turned away empty-handed. They got nothing. DiNardo and company came away. The Pope told them, and as we found out in a statement this week, don't do anything. We're not doing anything on that. Now the bishops are launching their own 4-diocese investigation to try to come to some answers. But the dioceses don't have to cooperate. They don't have to open their files. What do you make of that idea of the bishops launching their own lay investigation? And who's going to run this thing?
Yeah, well, that's the question. I mean, I like this, and I applaud our bishops that they've at least begun some process. You know, there, as you know, Raymond, you hear it from people, as I hear from people all the time. People are very angry out there, and they're very disappointed in the leaders of their own church that they are passionately faithful to.
Including a lot of clergy.
Right, including a lot of clergy. If this investigation is carried out properly, if there is credible information that they are able to obtain, if these are independent persons who can report back, and if there is stonewalling or resistance on the part of any diocese to cooperating with this investigation, that should be made known publicly, because it indicates there's something awry. If we cannot come clean within the United States about a limited number of things that people are going to look at in these 4 dioceses,
Right.
New York,
Metuchen,
Newark, and Washington, D.C., where McCarrick was active, if we can't clean that up ourselves, we'll never get anywhere. But I think the most distressing thing about what happened to our bishops in Rome is that the Holy Father is unwilling to go any further than that. And I don't understand this, because actually the promotion of McCarrick through the ranks far predates his papacy.
How do you think that happened, Bob?
Well, I think there's a network of people who protect and promote one another.
And it goes right up to the top.
Right.
You see, this is why my gut is the reason they don't want to have an official inquiry with the cardinal investigators made public is because it will reach right up to the upper levels, and it will embarrass those very near the Pope.
I would say, and look, I'm only speculating about this, but this is an informed speculation on my part. It seems to me that Cardinal Maradiaga, who's a close friend of both the Holy Father before he became Pope, and he's on that C9
group.
And also he was a very close friend of McCarrick's, and they did a lot of work together. I have the feeling that we see that McCarrick was somehow rehabilitated. Now, this is really the problem at this point. You know, however he got through up into the hierarchy, that's worth investigating. But bringing him back after 2013, basically from the dead, and even secular sources have confirmed that he was retired, he was not really active in anything any longer. Somebody helped that happen, and I have to believe, at least it's my own belief, that it was Cardinal Cardinal Maradiaga. And that brings, again, some of the Pope's closest collaborators into the spotlight, because if that is true, and then McCarrick begins to influence the appointment of bishops in the United States, Cardinal Supich out in Chicago, Cardinal Tobin in Newark, perhaps even the appointment of Cardinal Wuerl in Washington, D.C., and others. I mean, and others that we can look to. I mean, this really brings us to the heart of the upper echelons of the Church in the United States and processes in Rome as well.
Yeah. Well, we're hearing these stories scandals breaking in Germany, which Cardinal Marx came out this week and apologized. But the track record of some of these cardinals in Germany, it's an atrocity what happened there and what's happening still. The Netherlands, we're seeing the same thing. Where do you think this goes? How long can the Vatican simply look away and say, let the local church handle this?
I think they're going to try to look away as long as possible for the reasons that we just kind of outlined, because there are many persons who have been compromised in a greater or lesser extent in this entire process. But look, this is not going to go away. We know the Chileans are already, the Chilean secular authorities have gone in and subpoenaed records and whatnot. I don't know if this will happen in Argentina, because Argentina is such a corrupt place.
Yeah.
It could get buried, or it could not get buried. The investigation is taking place here. It's taking place in Ireland. It's taking place in Australia. And I think it's because of the secular authorities that it will be impossible to ignore this. I think the United States is fortunate that we're, in a way, as frustrated as we are with the slowness of the process and actually getting down to who's responsible. The United States is taking a bit of a lead here, as we often do in international matters. So if the secular authorities press forward with this, I think that the circle of protection is going to shrink and shrink. And at some point, I hope that Rome recognizes that the only way to make this go away is to come clean and have transparency, not about everything, because there do need to be some matters of discretion. You know, people commit some small peccadillo, but I'm not talking about abuse or cover-up of abuse. Serious things like that have to be now uncovered, because the light of day is going to come whether they want it or not.
Yeah. There's a story in Chicago that I've gotten hammered with emails all weekend from viewers wanting to know more about. This Father Kalchik, he was an associate pastor, becomes pastor. There was a rainbow flag over the sanctuary there. It was taken down, it was put into storage. When he came in, he said, we need to have an exorcism here. This church was known as kind of the gay parish, and he felt an exorcism was needed. There was an announcement that the gay rainbow flag would be burned outside of the church. Cardinal Cupich said that shouldn't happen. Parishioners took it upon themselves to burn it. The priest did the exorcism. Long story short, Cupich has removed him from the parish temporarily. Says he needs counseling, needs help. What do you make of this story?
Well, actually, he fled.
Yeah, well, now he's in hiding because he doesn't want to undergo the therapy.
Right, because they would send him to
St. Luke's. They said they're going to send him to St. Luke's. And, you know, the history of St. Luke's is just, I mean, we can't even get into it, but men are hanging themselves over there. There's been money stolen. It's a nightmare. Why we would send anyone there, I don't understand. But
look, I mean, this is the great irony of the moment in which we find ourselves. We have priests who are celebrated for promoting homosexuality, and I'm going to say that quite pointedly. They can talk about being receptive and open and whatnot, but it's promoting homosexuality. And someone who just stands up for what I still believe is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church about the teaching about sexuality. I mean, not to denigrate homosexuals, not to perpetrate violence or injustice against them, but someone who stands up about the fact of what homosexuality is according to Catholic teaching, official Catholic teaching, has to go into hiding at this point. I mean, the irony of this is stupendous. That we've got open pro-gay priests walking around, and a man who makes this gesture, which doesn't mean he's doing anything wrong against gay persons in particular, has to go into hiding. So it's a strange world that we're in. Right.
I want to move on to the Youth Synod. Archbishop Chaput this week issued an article where he laid out a 4-point critique of the preparatory document that really is going to govern the debate that you will be covering in Rome throughout this Youth Synod. And here are the critiques. The document displays a pervasive focus on social, cultural elements to the exclusion of deeper religious and moral issues. It has an inadequate grasp of the Church's spiritual authority. There's only a partial theological anthropology, a relativistic conception of vocation, and finally, an impoverished understanding of Christian joy. They also say that LGBT issues are going to somehow be highlighted in this synod. Your thoughts on all of that? Reading the document and about to take part in the synod?
Yeah, I'm leaving on Sunday night to go over to Rome for the entire month of October, and in a way I'm dreading it. I mean, I love Rome, but in a way I'm dreading this, because all that you just read is true and more, because I think as we go along, we're going to try to do some regular reports from the Catholic thing. I hope daily, but we'll see if it's possible to do that. But all that and more is already in the hopper. And if I had to just come up with one image for what this is like, you know, a pair of parents listening to a child, right? I mean, you have to listen to your children. But the parents have the ultimate responsibility to move the child into a more mature, fuller understanding of what the world is. Instead, with I think this focus on sociology and sort of contemporary youth attitudes, it's good to know what they are, but I think we already knew before we had a youth synod. The question is the dynamic going to be the church is going to move toward that, or is the church going to find ways to help talk to young people and elevate them from a culture that's highly toxic in its own right, but from a Christian standpoint is even more so. I mean, it blocks out many of the avenues of grace and of truth that we think are essential to human life. So my guess is, and I'm very happy that Archbishop Chaput brought that out. And by the way, he says it's a distinguished North American theologian, so it's not him, it's someone else who's asked to look into this. So we need to get ideas like this in circulation. And I think our American delegates, who are generally quite good, DiNardo, Robert Barron, Caggiano from Bridgeport, and others, Chaput himself, Jose Gomez from Los Angeles. These are some pretty solid guys. So I hope that they're going to play a major role. Chaput is on the committee for synods. There were 5 members, I think, of that committee that he's on. So he gets to help shape things. I'm not optimistic about where this is going to come out because it seems to me that the structure of it and the way that this document front loads a lot of issues will take us into the swamps, but let's pray.
How can they credibly have this synod in the midst of a global sex abuse crisis that directly impacts the lives of the youth that we're listening to?
Yeah. Well, as you know, 2 bishops have decided they will not attend. Right. Cardinal Tobin was personally appointed by Pope Francis, and because he says of the uproar over abuse in Newark, he asked to be excused.
And a Dutch bishop.
And we can imagine, you know, what it must be like in Newark if he doesn't think he can go over to Rome for an important meeting like this. The Dutch bishop, I think, more candidly said that this is not a good time for the leaders of the church to be talking about how they're going to shape the youth of the future, because there are just too many questions in the air, and lots of the major participants are implicated in these questions.
Well, we will leave it there. Robert Royal will check in with you throughout this synod, and safe travels. You can follow all of Robert Royal's commentary, his reports, at thecatholicthing.org.